Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to take my usual look at today's Prime Minister's questions, where Rishi Sunak showed absolutely zero evidence of preparation, even less in terms of moving up the learning curve. Absolute disaster for him. And the attacks against him, for which he was so poorly prepared today, will sting much more over the next few months. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news in politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So first of all, apologies if you can hear some machinery in the background. Some knobhead doesn't know it's autumn. And unfortunately, I have to record this at this time. But I try very hard to avoid the typical internet person destroys person Y. Person X destroys person Y. You see it all the time. Oh, so-and-so destroys so-and-so. In some political debate or other, it's almost never actually true. There are objectively good debaters, and it doesn't matter whether they're right or wrong. But mostly what it is, it's a case of person X says something that the author of the highly subjective report agreed with. But this was woeful for Sunak. I want to talk more tomorrow about where the resignation of Gavin Williamson leaves Sunak's campaign in general terms, but let's go through this bloodbath first. Basically, the Gavin Williamson scandals and the subsequent resignation were very much the focus of all 6 of Starmer's questions, with the angle used that Sunak's a weak leader. Starmer was going to raise essentially these same points, whether Williamson had resigned or not at this point. He was going to ask pretty much the same questions. In fact, because Williamson had resigned, actually put Sunak in a better position. It would have been way worse if Gavin Williamson was still sat there grinning alongside him. But it was still a position that Sunak failed to defend. Starmer began by asking how the victim of the alleged slit-your-throat verbal tirade from Williamson would have felt about Sunak saying he accepted the resignation with great sadness. Sunak just tried to say that he didn't know about these allegations. Well, you did at the time at which you said you were accepting the resignation with sadness, though, didn't you? And also the problem is, given what Tory MPs have been saying in the past week about Williamson, it would seem improbable that someone who's been a Conservative MP for the past 7 years would have been unaware that he is seen as a bully. In fact, Rishi Sunak was a Conservative MP while Gavin Williamson was a Chief Whip. Also, why didn't Sunak check? You're the Prime Minister, appointing cabinet ministers. You can understand a bit less scrutiny with more junior ministers. I mean, you've not got much choice with who you appoint there. But shouldn't you know about the people you're promoting to cabinet? Starmer then went on to describe Williamson as a pathetic bully. He asked if Sunak regretted appointing him. Sunak said that he did. He regretted appointing someone who had to resign. But he has made sure that the allegations have been investigated. Fine. Okay, we'll wait to see how that investigation pans out. But then Starmer turned the focus properly onto Sunak. After all, the way the public view Williamson is not going to be a major factor at the next election. He's not even a minister anymore. It's the way the public views Sunak that matters. Starmer said that everyone knows someone like Williamson, a sad middle manager getting off on intimidating those beneath him. Then he said, I also know someone like Sunak, the boss who is so weak, so worried the bullies will turn on him that he hides behind them. He asked what message it sends that rather than take on the bullies, he lines up alongside them and thanks them for their loyalty. Now that was the killer for me. And before I go over Sunak's response, I just want to point out what the front bench were looking at. I'll show you a little clip in a minute. I want to point out the front bench here. As Starmer was saying that, Sunak's senior cabinet colleagues largely expressionless, except for Chief Whip Simon Hart, who looks like someone's just sharted. But Sunak is looking inside his folder. Starmer's talking, looking inside his folder, looking for a response. Now, here's the thing. It's common enough for people at the dispatch box to have notes. Starmer had notes. Both sides have them. But if the Prime Minister is checking them as the leader of the opposition is talking, you presume it's to look up some technical information in order to answer the question. We know that they don't have an encyclopedic memory. They need to look things up. That's fine. Only Starmer wasn't asking about government policy or anything that could be classed as a technical question. He was asking about a decision that Rishi Sunak made on a personal level. There was no need to look anything up. So what was he doing? And I also want you to note from the clip when you watch it, I was astounded. When Starmer sat down, Sunak was still reading his folder, oblivious to what was going on. A Prime Minister up for the challenge As soon as the leader of the opposition sits down, they would be up and out of their seat before Starmer's arse touched the leather. Dominic Raab had to whisper in his ear. An aide behind him had to tap him on the shoulder to let Sunak know that it's time for him to stand up and say something. Sunak was actually startled when they do it. He was away with the fairies. He had no idea what was going on.
Mr. Speaker, everyone in the country knows someone like the member for South Staffordshire. Yeah. A sad middle manager getting off on intimidating those beneath him. Yeah. But everyone in the country also knows someone like the Prime Minister. The boss who is so weak, so worried the bullies will turn on him, that he hides behind them. What message does he think it sends when, rather than take on the bullies, he lines up alongside them and thanks them for their loyalty?
Mr. Speaker.
It was extraordinary. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it. Sunak was so completely out of his depth, he'd obviously mentally retreated to his safe place. And when Sunak did stand up, he just waffled on about delivering on the people's priorities. I mean, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised that he used generic response number 2 because he hadn't even heard the question. He wasn't even aware that Starmer had stopped speaking. Starmer then asked how Sunak can possibly stand up to vested interests if he can't stand up to bullies. He asked how much money had been raised from Shell from the windfall tax. Sunak tried to say, oh, he introduced the windfall tax. It was a bit careless because he refused for months after Labour and the Lib Dems had called for it. But Starmer made the point that Shell hadn't paid a penny in windfall tax. It's all right saying you've introduced a windfall tax. Why isn't it working? Why aren't these oil companies paying into it then? Sunak again tried to say he was delivering for people and jobs, which is another careless boast, because he was the Chancellor as the number of people in work plummeted. Never mind their fiddled low unemployment figures. The number in employment, which is partly what drives our economy, that's well down. And it's forecast to go down further next year. And just before I get into the final one from Starmer, moment of pure hilarity, which will sadly no longer exist if Musk does break Twitter. So a journalist from Huffington Post, Kevin Schofield, on Twitter, was remarking at just how I was, as I often do, following Twitter at the same time as watching it. And he was saying how badly it was going for Sunak. He said he'll soon have to break the glass and crack open the emergency Jeremy Corbyn attack line at this rate. And he did. A few minutes later, he did. I nearly wet myself. Shouldn't have been much of a prediction, really. Rishi Sunak's only been Prime Minister for 3 weeks, but he's already had to reach for that one a number of times. And Jeremy Corbyn himself, and he said it again today later on, remarking on Rishi Sunak seems to be living, or rather Jeremy Corbyn seems to be living rent-free in Rishi Sunak's head. But fatal, it gets him nowhere. I explained last week how it just doesn't work as an attack on Labour. And there's no sign of Sunak learning either. All of these questions about Williamson, these were, they weren't pleasant questions to have to field, but they were very predictable. There were no googlies bowled here or curveball for the Americans. By Starmer, they were just fairly straightforward. You could have predicted every single question. How was Sunak not better prepared for them? Highlights just how bad at politics he is. It may also highlight how bad at politics his advisors are as well, the people preparing him for it. But I'll talk more about that maybe in tomorrow's video. But yeah, absolute bloodbath on the Williamson questions. If that had been a prize fight, Sunak he'd be curled up in a ball with 3 cracked ribs, a shattered jaw and half his teeth littering the floor. Starmer used the Williamson mess to paint Sunak as not just someone who tried to use a bully, but was too weak to oppose one. Someone who would be too weak to stand up for the nation's interests at all. Now that's arguably a more effective line than someone being cynical enough to use bullies. Because, painting Sunak as a would-be bully, some voters don't seem to mind that. But nobody wants a weak leader. It was almost a mercy when Ian Blackford of the SNP turned his attention to the corruption of Boris Johnson, asking if Sunak would keep one of Johnson's deferred peers in his cabinet, as he's referring to the Secretary of State for the Scotland office, Alistair Jack, who's in line for a peerage in Johnson's resignation honours. But the MPs who are getting peerages have all agreed to defer it, because otherwise they would have to step down as MPs and then trigger very embarrassing by-elections. So they're going to defer their peerage until after the next election. But Sunak refused to comment on what he said. He said, oh, I'm not going to say anything about Johnson's honours list. It's like Blackford wasn't asking about Johnson's honours list. He was asking why a baron in waiting, as he put it, should be running a government department. Needless to say, Sunak dodged that question as well. But for good measure, I am going to throw in one backbencher question at the end as well. So Barry Shearman of Labour asked what Sunak would do to ensure that children do not go to bed hungry. Sunak said that the best solution was to ensure they don't grow up in a workless household. So there you are. If you can't afford food, it's not because of your slave wages, it's because you're not working. Take the pet pills and do a third job overnight, you lazy serfs. That was always the Tory line, of course. Pretend that poverty doesn't exist in working households, that poverty only exists where people are too lazy to do anything. But you would think it'll be harder and harder to make it work as more working households feel the squeeze. But yes, third PMQs, it was impossible for anyone to put a positive spin on that for Sunak without just making it up. You know, if you read any article saying that Sunak did well there, they wrote that in advance and just put in a few lines later on. It was abject. And for Tory MPs watching it, who might want to console themselves with the fact, oh, maybe there's probably not that many people watch PMQs. You know what they will watch, though? The election TV debates. Is he going to run from them like Johnson did with about half of them? And even Johnson turned up to a couple. He will be hopeless. Maybe not Liz Truss levels of hopeless, but the people watching won't be comparing Sunak with Liz Truss. They'll be comparing him with Keir Starmer. And consider this is before Sunak has really done anything. We haven't had the budget statement yet. We haven't seen what winter has to bring yet. Even when the budget's announced, it doesn't get implemented till next year. What happens when the headlines are all about recession? What happens if he doesn't deal with the ongoing industrial action? What happens when he has to jump one way or the other on the two highly controversial Brexit bills passing through the House? If the first few weeks of a new Prime Minister's time in office are the easiest, and they are, he is in trouble. In fact, I'm not even sure this week that the polls will show a further closing between Labour and the Conservatives. If anything, Labour may extend it after this performance. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.